thanks so much for having me, and thanks a lot for the introduction as well. So let me just share my screen if I can find it here. All right, you all see this now, right? Yeah, yes. Great. Okay, so yes, hi everyone. I am a postdoc at Harvard, but I'm currently in Denmark because of the pandemic, and I will stay here for a bunch of years afterwards as well. Right, so this paper is on selection in migration, cultural selection in migration, and the consequences that this can have for migrant-sending societies. So studies on selections are quite core to research on migration, I think more so than research in other topics in economics. And that's for two reasons. So first, this study looking at selection, so on how migrants differ from people who choose not to migrate, not only sheds light on the underlying drivers and barriers to migration, but importantly, they also shape the consequences of migration. So if you have selection on a given trait, then migration away from a population can alter or will alter the composition of these traits in the population. So I think the most famous example of this is the literature on the brain drain. Right. So in economics, studies on selection in migration has focused on wealth, skills, and sort of the availability of information for obvious reasons. But we know that this is not everything that matters. So there's also literature outside of economics that emphasizes non-economic characteristics. So for instance, migration often involves tearing existing social bonds because you leave them behind. And we know from psychology that this can lead to feelings of social and existential loss, especially if you feel very connected to the place where you come from. So there are other costs to migration than pure economic costs, right? So this has motivated one of the more famous hypotheses in this literature outside of economics, which states that if you rely on social groups for a sense of identity and support, so this is what we also call collectivist traits or collectivism as opposed to individualism, then you will prefer to stay within your group and thereby have a lower propensity to migrate away from this group. So this is, of course, conditional on the general migration away from this group. So a potential implication of this is that we could see cultural change in migrant-sending populations. So this is based on this idea or definition of culture that we know that cultural traits are portable and transmitted across generations, and perhaps more persistent than, for instance, human capital or education. So if you have a change in the composition of people with different cultural traits in a society, then perhaps this can persist for a longer time than if you have selection on other traits. So this can matter for economic outcomes. So this cultural dimension of individualism, collectivism is one of the most studied cultural traits in economics. And it has been linked to small scale versus large scale cooperation, and also the diffusion of ideas and technology. Okay. So what I do in this paper is that I examine the role of collectivist traits in shaping the propensity to migrate, and then I draw implications for migrant-sending districts. And my case will be Scandinavia in the age of mass migration. So everything that you'll see from now on is they are new results. So the working paper that's on my website is a bit old. And so I'm updating everything. It's going very slow because of the pandemic. So just bear in mind that these results will be different from the paper if you've had a look at that. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of historical background. The age of mass migration was a period between 1850 and 1920, where around 40 million Europeans left Europe, and the majority settled in the US. This was following a sharp decline in transportation costs, which sort of made this immigration option available to everyone across social classes in Europe. Immigration from Scandinavia was particularly intense, so around 25% of the populations left. So these migrants, they were attracted by economic prospects and freedom. So we know from other research that upward mobility was more widespread in the US, largely in part to the availability of free or very cheap land. And the US also had a more equal income distribution than a lot of countries in Europe. And this led to the outflow of particularly low-skilled and poorer people from Europe. The thing is that not everyone left, and the question that I'm posing is if other factors played a role as well. Okay, so the data that I will use to answer these questions will all be at the individual level. So my data on the populations of Scandinavia come from population censuses at the time. In various years. So here I have full count information on every individual in the population with family structures, occupations, and other demographic information, and also other characteristics of socioeconomic status things. So, right? And I'll match this with a database on nearly everyone who left. So I combine and collect passenger lists from various local archives. So these are lists from the ships that carried immigrants across the Atlantic to the US. So from 1868 and 1867, these shipping companies, they were required to record all the personal details of everyone who left and report this to the authorities. And this was monitored and also checked. And if they failed to live up to these requirements, then these companies would be put out of business. So these records, these passenger lists, are known to be of very high quality. So I gather information on a little bit more than 1.7 million first-time immigrants. So if you compare this to official numbers, it's around 82% of the total immigration flows from Scandinavia. So it's not complete, but I do a bunch of validation checks to make sure that they are very representative of the true immigration flows from these countries. Okay. All right. So with this data, I need proxies of collectivism. So with this data, I have information on the composition of the households, what everyone was doing in the households, the jobs, and other things. The thing is that you have to be a little bit creative when you want to look at cultural traits, because you can't travel back in time and do surveys or experiments on these people. So I rely instead on 3 proxies of collectivism. So one is whether you give your children common first names. Another is if you live in extended versus nuclear family structures. And a third is if you tend to have intra-group marriage. So that would be partners marrying or people marrying someone from the same community as yourself. So I'll go a little bit into detail with the first one. So I just want to briefly explain number 2 and 3 here. So those are quite, I mean, they're not commonly used as proxies because there's not a lot of research on culture in history, but they're sort of known to be manifestations of a collectivist culture because they sort of, they are actions that you do to maintain close bonds between members of your local community. So they're sort of in accordance with this idea or preference for living in dense networks, which is a key characteristic of a collectivist culture. So I can see here that are there questions in the chat? Should I check that, Sofie?
Anu, would you like to ask your question right away?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Just a quick question about the second part. So living in extended versus nuclear family, how do you tell that apart from differences in income levels? Because it could be that people who are poorer, they are more likely to live in an extended family because they cannot afford living.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I'll get to how, so I have a bunch of variables or measures of socioeconomic status. I don't have income, but I do a lot of other things that I'll get back to that. So maybe we can, if you're not satisfied, let's talk about it later. All right, so let me just return to this proxy of giving your children common first names. So this is based on a long-standing literature in social psychology. So from here, we know that commonness or sort of the popularity of a name is a key driver of first name choice. So it's something that parents care about. It has, there's an agreement in this literature that they reflect a balance between independent and social identity. So if you choose a name that is common within a group, then you signal that it's to this group that I belong. And vice versa, if you choose a name that is more uncommon, then this can reflect sort of an independence from the social groups around you. So this is not just an empirical or like a theoretical idea. It has also been validated in this literature with surveys of children and parents, where they do personality tests and also surveys and find that it is exactly people who choose more common names, they tend to be more collectivist in their cultural traits, and vice versa. I complement this literature and do more validation checks, both with contemporary data and with historical data from surveys and also from text. So I can get back to this in the discussion if you want to hear more about that. Right.
There's a question by Lisa Höckel.
Okay. Should I read it or, okay.
I have a question, like a very short one. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was wondering the importance of at what level you measure your in-group, because that depends very much with how common the name actually is. So like if I see whole of Norway as my in-group, or like, so I was wondering to which level your measure of collectivism there refers to.
Yeah, so it's important that it's at the very local level. So it's because you would not know everyone in Norway, and information did not flow as freely at that time as it did today. So what I do is my reference group here will be the past 10 birth cohorts that lived in the same district as yourself, right? So just remember, these are traits of the parents. So if a parent chooses a common name, it's reflective of the parents' preferences. And I think it's fair to assume that it's the previous 10 birth cohorts that is sort of the information that is mostly available to, or most relevant to the parents. And the districts are, I can just briefly show you here. So these are actually the districts. I don't know if you know a lot about Scandinavian geography, but in Norway is pretty, it's not very densely populated compared to Sweden, for instance. So you could actually get lower at the municipality level, but you also need sort of enough children to produce accurate statistics on this. So I rely on the districts, and I do some robustness checks on this as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, so this is just to give you a sense of just a few examples of what these names were. So from the earlier census in each country. So as you can see here, among children below the age of 10, names were extremely concentrated on a few. Around 10% of all children were named the same or called the same name. And you don't have to go very far down in the rank distribution of these names. If you get to just number 20, 30, 40, and 50, which is also shown here, they're associated with very low shares among these children. All right, and this, like the uncommon names on this graph, are not strange or weird in any way. So these are all names that are widely used today, or like stable names in Scandinavia. And I have a lot of family members among these uncommon names as well, right? Okay, So moving on to the analysis, unless there are more questions. Right, okay. Oh, is there a question?
No, you can continue.
Great, okay, so I divide my analysis into two parts. So the first will be on selection, so just documenting patterns of selection in migration at the individual level. And the second part will be on the consequences for across districts in Scandinavia, right? So in the first part, to study if there is selection in migration, I need to know who migrates and who does not. And here I produce a number of linked samples where the idea is that I have a sample of boys in the earlier censuses. And then I determine if they immigrate based on a link to either the latest census for each country or the most or the passenger list. So if I find them in the passenger list, I define them as immigrants. And if I find them in a later census towards the end of the age of mass migration, I will define them as stayers. And the reason that I look at boys is that it's difficult to link girls when they change their last name at marriage. And looking at boys means that I identify their childhood households. And the idea of this analysis is to check how the collectivist traits of the household determine or predict immigration when I compare this to other characteristics of the household. So these are characteristics that the child does not have any influence on, but they sort of shape the upbringing and the perspectives of these children. Okay, so I link on name, birth year, and either the district of birth or the district of residence. There are a number of challenges. So first of all, it's easier to link people with uncommon names. And it's difficult to locate immigrants who have moved since childhood. And the problem here is that I don't know the birthplace of these immigrants. I just know the last district of residence. So I do a number of things to rule out that there are any biases that are driving my results. I vary my linking requirements, and I also conduct a group level analysis, which I will get back to, that includes every immigrant and stayer in the population. So just bear that in mind. All right, so this is the regression analysis or the regression model that I run. So I relate the decision to immigrate to the collectivism or collectivist traits in the childhood household, and a bunch of childhood control variables as well. So this will be, for instance, the age of the child, family size, number of brothers, different measures of birth order, and whether you have foreign parents or lived outside the district of your birth. And also I have controls for other names characteristics, so whether you have a common last name, whether you have a name that is shared with another family member. So you have this tradition of passing on names in the family, which sort of ended around this time, but still I control for it. And then I have a number of controls for socioeconomic status. So whether you live in urban or rural areas, engaged in farming, whether your parents relied on poor relief, if you had servants employed in the household, and then also whether you were related to the household head. Okay. So later I have, for a subset, I also have the exact occupation of the father. So I can do father's occupation fixed effects as well, but that's for a robustness check. All right, and then I have a bunch of fixed effects for birth decade, birth district, and census fixed effects. So the idea here is to get us close to comparing children who grew up in the same place under the same circumstances, but differed in the intensity of collectivism in your childhood household. Okay, so these are the results. Across panels here, so this is a proxy for each panel, you see that having a common first name, living in an extended family, or having parents that came from the same place, these are all associated with a lower propensity to immigrate later on. Okay, so having a name that is among the top 10, for instance, is associated with around 1.2, 1.3, or 1.3 percentage point lower probability of immigration. So if you just compare these to the means in these sample, it's quite substantial. Okay, and these results are robust to all of these childhood controls that I just mentioned. Okay, are there any questions on this? Okay, so these results are robust to different link samples where I varied the requirements. Also a group level analysis that includes all immigrants and stayers. So here I conduct the analysis at the group level among people who share the same first name, place of residence, gender, and birth year. And then I average my controls and variables within these groups. And here I can see that among people who had, for instance, more common names, there was also a lower propensity to immigrate on the whole. So these results are not driven by any biases in the linking process. I can also do alternative measures of first commonness. For instance, I can do that of the oldest brother in the family, and I see the same results, which sort of which suggests that this is a family effect rather than an individual effect. And then I can include more fixed effects. Okay, so there's selection in the cross section. So average selection on collectivist traits in or individualistic traits in migration at this point in time. So what I do next is I look at heterogeneity in this selection. So what I want to do here is sort of categorize pioneers from followers. So you had people who left first, where there were no migration networks abroad, for instance. Are these different than those who followed when mass migration had already sort of taken off? And it would be easier to join networks of your own kinds in the US, for instance. Because if this is so, then it tells us something about the mechanisms or the underlying mechanisms to these results. So here I'm interested in finding out if in circumstances and situations where the social cost would be lower of migration, then you would have weaker selection and more immigration of collectivist types, for instance. And this is exactly what I find. So first I find that in decades or in times and places where you already had a lot of community migration, selection was indeed weaker and more collectivist people would also leave. And I can also look at the passenger list and actually see that people with more common names, they tended to migrate collectively. So they would migrate with family members or with other people from their towns or with the purpose of joining someone abroad, okay? And when they actually arrive in the US, I can observe them in the US censuses. And here I see that people with common first names, they tended to settle with other Scandinavians or other people of their own nationality. They tended to marry other people of their own nationality and also provide or give their children more Scandinavian sounding first names, okay? So I can sort of document these patterns of migration from the hometowns of these people onto the ships and then all the way to the US, okay? And these results are in accordance with what you would expect, given that this is a culture that is driving this and not other factors. Okay, all right, so for the last minutes here, 7 minutes, I'll talk about the effects in migrant sending districts. So the question here is if the cultural landscape in Scandinavia changed as a result of this selection. So in the short run, you would have a change in the composition of cultural traits. And this is what I refer to as the cultural shock of immigration. Whether this persists over the longer run depends on a number of things. It depends on if you have intergenerational persistence in these traits. So if it's something that is inherited across generations, I have evidence that it is something that it's extremely persistent at the local level and also to some degree at the family level. And then it would also depend on different steady states, cultural steady states. All right, so what I do in this analysis is first to calculate or approximate this cultural shock. And then I want to see how that explains culture today, for instance, or culture in the medium run in this period. Okay, so this is I'm working on this at the moment, so it's not a nice graph. I didn't have time to make a map of these. I just finished these today because I'm updating the results. But this is sort of an approximation of these shocks across districts in Scandinavia. So it's a change in the share of people in the population with common first names, and then average across birth cohorts, where I weigh them in different. I can weigh them in different ways, but with a larger weight on birth cohorts that sort of lived throughout the entire period. You can see here that, and I get this information again because I have the names of everyone in the passenger lists and the names of everyone in the population. So by including or excluding these immigrants from the distribution in the censuses, I can get sort of a pre and post share and then calculate the difference between the two. In Denmark, there was not a lot of things happening. So immigration was quite low and selection was not as strong as in the other countries. If you look at Norway and Sweden, you see that in some districts you would have a change in the level of 5 percentage points. So this is quite significant, actually. There's also in some districts where you would have a negative change. So this means that the populations got more individualistic, that you actually had an outflow of collectivist types, which can be explained by some of the things that I just talked about. Either you would have a sudden increase in mass migration where people would leave in large groups, for instance. So there are different things that could explain this, but on the whole, you would see an outflow of individualistic types and a change towards more collectivism in the populations. All right, so to check if this is also something that persists, I do a number of things. So most importantly, I predict contemporary cultural differences today across Scandinavia. So here I use data from the World and European Value Surveys, and they have a sort of a suggested measure of individualism that where there's an emphasis on individual autonomy, lifestyle, liberty, equality, and freedom. I can also look at the subcomponents. Turns out to be individual autonomy and lifestyle freedom that where I find the strongest associations. And then I link this to the historical characteristics of each subnational district. So there's a question.
Tamara, please.
So thanks for the interesting paper. So I wondered, in relation to this mechanism you're talking about right now, as you have all the census data as well, whether you also looked at those people who were on the passenger list and then appeared in the census data again. So those people who returned, and what kind of selection you may find there.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. I mean, I can't identify return passengers. I haven't done it. It would, perhaps I can do it in the future, but it's going to be with like sort of triple linking, which will be introducing a lot of noise, I think. I know that in Lund in Sweden, they have a massive project on identifying return migrants, and they are like 7 people on the project. So, I mean, it's not completely straightforward. So the only thing that I can sort of assume here is that they would make these persistence regressions more noisy, that they will just add noise, because we know that it actually differed across districts and how many returned. And there are no official agreed upon numbers on how many actually return. So this is sort of an unknown thing in this analysis, but it's a fair point, right? Okay, so just to like summarize the intuition here is that what I do in this analysis is that I take 2 individuals who live in different districts today, and then I predict their individualism based on the historical level of collectivism. So that would be a negative relationship. in the district, and then this cultural shock of migration between that point in the past and the end of the age of mass migration. And it looks like this formally, and these are the results. So here you see that in places or districts where you had a historical higher level of concentration in first names, you would have lower individualism today. So this just speaks to general persistence. But on top of that, you also see that in places where you had a particularly high outflow of immigrants with individualistic traits, here you see a lower level of individualism today. So this is also as we would expect, given that we expect these things to persist over the past or over time. Of course, we would also expect them to weaken over time, but at least over this period of 100 to 150 years, we see sort of that this change in the cultural composition persisted over time. So I can introduce a number of control variables here. So for instance, I can control for the actual rate of immigration to sort of separate overall immigration from the cultural composition among immigrants, and also a bunch of geographical and historical controls. So this is one way to sort of study this persistence. I can also use other outcomes. So for instance, names today or concentration of names today, or actually just after the age of mass migration, that works fine as well. I've done analysis on sort of decade to decade change in the historical period as well, to sort of also study the effects of lags. And I will introduce that in the paper again. Yeah, and it's also robust to different ways of calculating this cultural shock. All right, so that's a question from Panu, or?
Yeah, I wanted to ask that, do the geographic controls include urbanization?
Back then or today?
Back then.
Yeah, I can do an urban control too. So that would be among the historical controls. Let me see what I have here. Yeah, I mean, I can't really, I can't remember if I put it in here or not, but yes, I can control for that. I mean, it's not a lot of observations that I have here. It's across 50 districts. That's not really clear from this table, but it's only across 50 districts. So there's not a lot of power in this analysis, which means that, I mean, I take this more as suggestive evidence of this having persistent effects over time. If I introduce too many controls, then I can run out of power in this analysis. So I also try to do like some of these other things to make sure that, for instance, in this decade to get panel type regressions, you can have district fixed effects, for instance, and then to only look at changes over time. Right.
There's
also urbanization
could,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Urbanization could also be an endogenous control to the level of collectivism. I mean, I also see results on internal migration. So in places where you had a more collectivist culture, you would be less likely to also migrate to the city or to other districts. So there's also something going on here that's not completely clear. There was another.
There are two more questions, one by Jonas and one by Lisa. Maybe we can collect them before you answer.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. It's very fascinating stuff. My question is, what do you think determines the magnitude of the cultural shocks across districts? So where does this come from? And is the effect that you see in this third analysis, is that maybe also due to different causes of the shocks?
And I also have a bit more of a general question. I was wondering if you came across any evidence that there's a payoff to having a common name to certain occupations, which might be more frequent, which are more frequent in some areas over others.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just take the last one first. So I've only begun to look at this because I want to make sure that this is not driven by economic. I mean, it's difficult to compare payoffs in the US to Europe. Here you would have like what research usually does here is to compare siblings with different characteristics. And here, as I study a family thing, that's not really possible in my case. So just comparing the payoffs in, for instance, the US to the payoff in Norway or Sweden, that would be that would be very conditional, depending on the quality of the data and different measures of payoff. So I've looked at the payoff to different types in the US. Here I see that having an uncommon name is associated with a higher payoff. But I can actually see that depending on where you settle all these like assimilation outcomes, there's no significant difference between the payoff to different types depending on your intensity of assimilation. So at least this suggests that it's not payoffs that are driving where you settle and how you settle into society in the US. But I can't rule out in Scandinavia, you also have a higher payoff to uncommon names than not. But I mean, I think I would need to do a little bit more of a sophisticated analysis on this. At the moment, I cannot completely rule out that some of this would be driven by payoffs to different types. But I think that like my overall evidence on also how you migrate and how you settle supports this idea that it's mainly that it is also culture that is driving it and not just pure economic payoffs. All right, so the first question on what determines these shocks. So I've actually spent a lot of time looking at this and it's not really clear because it's a composition of two factors. So you have, like when you have higher immigration, you would have sort of a larger shock. But the intensity of selection depends on how much immigration you also have. So I've looked at, for instance, if it's determined by, I can see that if you have more variation in a population, then you see a higher shock. If you have like polarization, so a lot of individualistic people, perhaps very individualistic people and a lot of very collectivist people, then you would be more likely to see the departure of very individualistic people compared to the mean or compared to those who stay. And there I see a large change. I mean, I don't see a lot of other very strong predictors of this. At least it's not linear. So if you have suggestions or ideas, I would be very happy to hear that. Because I mean, again, I can't, like the reason I've looked at it is also if I can sort of identify this shock, sort of IV it with something. But I mean, so far I haven't really been able to do so. So again, this is more suggestive than,
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so let me just conclude. So what I do in this paper is that I document patterns of selection on collectivist traits in the age of mass migration. So Scandinavians from collectivist households were more likely to immigrate. And if they, less likely to immigrate, and if they did immigrate, they were more likely to do so collectively and settle in places with people of the same descent. And their departure, at least that's suggestive evidence that the departure generated lasting relative change towards more collectivism in Scandinavia that we see up until today. Okay, so there's a question then. I mean, I don't think that with every historical research you need to justify it with external validity, but if you just look at immigrants across the EU today, you actually also do see that comparing immigrants with stayers in the EU today, you see that immigrants are more likely to be associated with individualistic traits like independence and not conformity and tradition. So there is some evidence here that is also that there is external validity to some of these findings. Okay. All right, so thanks.